Thank you so much for joining us this evening and welcome. I'm Karen Gibbs with Maryland Public Television. We hope you are captivated by PUSHOUT and we're looking forward to having a great discussion this evening. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat and we'll do our very best to answer as many questions as possible. Before we get started with our discussion, I'd like to introduce Tanaj Moody. She's Director of Programming at From Prison Cells to PhD. Tanaj, would you say a few words?
Yes, thank you so much for this. And hello, everyone. Welcome. From Prison Cells to PhD, our mission is to inspire others with similar backgrounds to excel beyond what society and life circumstances have set to be the norm. And we do this by providing mentoring and educational counseling to currently and formerly incarcerated members so that they can position themselves to start building a career opposed to just obtaining temporary employment. We have many ways you can get involved with From Prison Cells to PhD, or in other words, P2P, through volunteering, by tutoring, being a policy associate, a pen pal, and so many other ways. I'm actually going to link the form in the chat box if you are interested in volunteering and supporting the program. You can click on the link in the bio and put your information in there. Women and gender nonconforming women and cisgender, we actually just recently launched a women's cohort. And in this cohort, it's called the Persevering Women of Courage and Resolve. And we specifically focus on women's strengths in relation to compassion. And we'll be hosting our second pilot program of this on April 25th. And you can learn more about that by filling out the information form and getting some more information. Thank you.
We're joined by three incredible women. Please join me in welcoming Jacoba Atlas, Director, Writer, and Executive Producer, PUSHOUT. Denise Pines, Executive Producer, PUSHOUT. And Kimberly Haven, Director of Policy, Advocacy, and Outreach from Prison Cells to PhD. Ladies, welcome, and let's get right to it. Colby, can you tell us how this film came about?
Sure, I'd love to. And thank you for inviting us. Thank you for showing this film. And all of us who worked on it are so pleased that it's had the impact it's had, because this was really a labor of love and mission for all of us. So Denise and I had worked on a couple of documentaries for PBS about education, and one of them was called Too Important to Fail, which was about African-American boys and the challenges they faced in schools. And at the time, she and I kept talking about, well, what about girls? What about girls? Why are they not part of this conversation? And we knew we wanted to do this documentary, but we needed to find the perfect collaborator. And I read Dr. Monique Morris's book, who you saw in the documentary, PUSHOUT. And Denise and I met with her, and she agreed to work with us. And that changed everything for us, because she is such a compelling and compassionate person. And she was the co-writer of this. She did the interviews with the girls. And it's her vision that we really tried to realize on the screen.
Kobe, thank you. Denise, can you share some insights on what's being done to rectify what's happening to these young girls?
You know, these issues are complex, right? And we always say that about education, but it really is, because there's so many, sort of things wrapped around education, the schools themselves, the teachers, the administrators, the policies that shape the school systems, the parents that need to be involved, individuals, us, the community-based organizations. But something really big happened last year towards the end of the summer. And there was the Black Girl Freedom Fund was created, an initiative that came out of the Grant Makers for Girls of Color with Monique Morris. Dr. Morris is the executive director of. And it called for an investment of $1 billion over 10 years for Black girls and young women. So this might seem radical, like $1 billion for Black girls, but when you look at the amount of money given in philanthropy, look at when that whittles down to girls of color and women of color, it ends up being only $5.48 of current giving. So clearly we have a giving gap in this space. And one of the reasons that we see why it's so tough for organizations that work with girls of color who have revenues that are 250,000, and when you look at Black girl focus, really budgets that are about 50,000 annually. So a lot of people are working, unpaid staff is the only word I can use for that. So that's something that's really big, that put a really big lens on Black girls. 1 billion for Black girls. You know, why do we need 1 billion for Black girls? And that is what starts to help elevate the conversation and help to focus on the issues. You know, the film obviously had a tremendous success. We got a lot of media attention on the film. We did a lot of screenings. And so, you know, that's sort of the first part, is the creating the awareness for people who did not realize that there actually was a problem with Black girls in school. One, because we talk so much about Black boys and the school to prison pipeline. But that same pipeline is there for Black girls and really other girls of color.
Denise, thank you. Kim, can you speak about what's going on at the local level?
Well, I think that, and thank you for the question. I think that there's a lot of things happening at the local level that are also reverberating even larger than local levels. Through this documentary, people are beginning to have the difficult conversations about what school really means for Black girls and the challenges that they're facing, the stigma that they're facing, and the trauma that they're coming every day to school with. And so people are starting to ask what can be done. What do we want to do with this? And so, for instance, in Maryland, we're looking at legislation, the federal legislation that was introduced by Representative Ayanna Pressley. So people are looking at trying to legislate, and like funders, we're looking at how do we fund programs? How do we put more money into these young girls? Well, legislation also has to be in there as well. And while I always hate to, try to legislate people's behavior, clearly we need to legislate people's behavior. So the conversation really does start in the home. It starts in the church. It starts in the hairdresser, the barbershop, the grocery store. It starts with that community saying, we need to do better. Our girls deserve better. And that starts the conversation that can have those local, state, and national legislative impacts.
Well, Kim, let me ask you this, because I see all the pressures that are on these young girls, the isms that arose in the film, and of course, all the stress that goes along with middle school and high school. Is this just a perfect storm, or is it by design?
Well, I think it's actually all of those. And I think that the perfect storm is a lot bigger than just school and hormones and the isms. I think that we don't take into account the impact of media, social media, the TikTok generation, the music. I don't think we take into consideration all of the ways that people's identity is shaped and formed by what they see and hear, and also how people respond to that. And so we do not take into consideration that these young girls don't know how to process that. I mean, in middle school, they're still forming. And so how do we how do we take this safe space, make this safe space for them to figure out for themselves their identity? How do we support them in doing all of this? And so when we talk about a perfect storm, it is a very huge storm of things that these young girls are battling and trying to manage, and then trying to rise above to identify for themselves their futures.
Some of us are still struggling with those issues.
Right.
So I think we have some questions from the audience. Let's see here. Okay. Who did the song at the start of this video with the Black Lives Matter refrain? It was a great song. Kobe?
Oh, yes. Oh, they're an amazing duo. I know they sound like there's many more of them. It's Poetry Rising, and we heard this song. Monique knew about them, and was just the perfect song. We just felt like, oh my goodness. I mean, there are lots and lots of verses of it, and you can see them online and see what incredible work they do. But it was just it was the perfect song. The moment we heard it, we wanted it, and they were very happy to participate in this documentary.
It really set the tone.
I want to say something else about how we shot this. I mean, and it's not.
It really did. And as we were editing, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to.
Sorry, Denise, go ahead.
No, I was just going to add to kind of our how we did this production. So everyone behind the scenes on the production were all women. We initially started off trying to have it all Black women, but what we realized as we traveled the country to tell the story, that there were gaps in, entertainment. One of the biggest gaps we found was in an audio engineer. And part of that is because the equipment is so heavy for a woman to have to, hold on to the mic that goes over where you don't see it. So we, were really intentional about sort of bringing a certain kind of energy to this project from the very beginning. So everything behind the scenes was done with women.
And intentional.
And I just want to yes, and very important. The editor in a documentary, the other most important person you work with is the editor. And our editor is a Black woman. She's from France. She's lived in this country for 22 years now. But when I spoke to her, she said, I'm not African American. I'm Caribbean French. But she understood this in her bones, of course, and she was a perfect collaborator too. She was really crucial on that. And we did, it's interesting what Denise said. It's particularly difficult to find really skilled craft people, the crew. And one of the great things that's happening now, and this is a little bit of a digression, but Ava DuVernay has started an organization that is actually supporting women of color in all aspects of the crew. That's audio, that's visual, there's a million things that you can do other than be a director. And Ava DuVernay's company is trying to highlight those women and give them the chance to be known.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Thank you. Another question from the audience. What do we do to support teachers to move beyond tolerating students to accepting students?
Well, I'll just jump in for a second and just highlight again the Columbus School that you saw in the documentary. I think that's a pretty good example of what can be done, where the principal, Stephanie Patton, who was the principal then, she's now actually working with all the schools in Columbus, Ohio. But I know it's kind of amazing that she's been elevated to the next level so that what she put in place at the Columbus School can be replicated in other places. And I think that what you saw in the documentary, the way they worked, the way they talked with the teachers, who, as we know, and you heard that in the documentary, most of the teachers in our school system, in our public school system, are white. And even the ones that want to do really well for their students and try to be the best educator they can be need some support system from the community so that they can understand this better. And I don't mean that in any condescending way, but it's really important.
I think, can I add on to that? I think what they did is, she ended up actually reading Monique's book and made a decision that they were no longer going to punish girls for having a bad attitude. So I think it starts with a premise of what isn't going to happen at your school anymore. If you're saying, I'm not going to suspend another student, then what does that mean? How do you back out of that statement? They looked at doing things that were unusual. I mean, we talk about restorative justice programs, which they put into place. They improved their teacher-student relationships by ensuring that every student had an adult that they could go to in a moment of crisis. They created these safe spaces in the corridors. So, if I was having sort of a bad moment or a bad day, I could actually go into this safe space and sort of, work my mind through it or work my anger through it. If somebody made me angry, So really, like things that really don't happen, they looked at like what makes sense. And I think that's how we have to approach, the way we've been teaching isn't the way we should continue to teach, right? That model is broken. And I think when a lot of young people return back to school, we're going to see that schools are going to have to put into place something different, because these young people have experienced something different in their lives. And schools that recognize that the same old way that we teach, the same old way we communicate is not going to effectively graduate students and set these students off to be the best that they can be, in the world that we put them into.
And COVID has added another layer of this trauma.
Yes.
Oh, it has.
Yes.
Yeah.
Another question from the audience. When focused on discipline and over-discipline and wrongful discipline of Black girls, are any of these student interviewees coming from schools who practice PBIS or RTI? And would you explain those acronyms?
Well, I think Denise just pretty well explained it to a certain extent. I mean, Columbus School that we went to does do all of that. And it's one of the reasons why we chose it. As Denise said, they had read Monique's book and wanted to do things differently. And you can see them doing things differently. They absolutely give girls the space to talk to each other, to be who they feel they are at the moment, and they're not punished for that. So one of the things that they do, I know Denise went through a bunch of them, but one of the amazing things that they do that I thought was pretty incredible is that somebody can say, I need a timeout, I need to leave the classroom. And there's no punishment for that. They can leave the classroom, gather their thoughts, gather their emotions, and then come back when they're ready. And it really, one of the things that always gets to me is that it's really about adults understanding what their role is in shaping the lives of young people. And they really need to pull up their big pants and say, we can do this. We can respect the girls. We can respect them as individuals. We can respect their hearts and their minds and not dictate everything. I don't want to go on and on, but one of the things that absolutely amazed me was when I was in that classroom and you could see the chaos. It was organized chaos, but it was chaos. But the girls were learning and they were excited and the teacher was engaging in it. So that's one of the things that they just decided there's another way of dealing with these girls without punishment, without authoritarianism, and it really does work.
And I think that goes to the question that you asked me earlier, Karen, about how this plays out at the local level currently. If teachers are willing to, as she said, pull up the big girl panties, and administrators are willing to pull up the big girl panties, then the community needs to support that, because there's a model that clearly works. What we have currently does not work. And so, at the end of the day, I mean, you could almost say, what do we have to lose by trying something new? But all that model that we saw in this film shows that it takes the commitment. But in order to have that commitment, the teachers and the staff need to have that support. So they need the training, they need the money. We need to invest in, doing things differently. And so that's another way that this can play out at the local level.
And get everyone else to buy in on the program.
Right.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yes.
I mean, if you hear Stephanie talk, I mean, she didn't need a lot of money to do what she did. But she needed the commitment. She needed to be the leader. Right. She needed to be the one to say, I need to learn as well, and I'm going to learn. So that's why I got Monique's book. So the leader has to be an example, and not everything has a cost factor to it, right? It has a care factor to it.
Right.
Yes.
Good point.
It's not always about the money.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Unless you're a legislator.
So true. So true.
Sorry.
Another audience question. How can we support our children during this time of remote learning when the biases in education have shifted?
It's a difficult question, isn't it? I mean, there's going to be a lot of things that I think we're going to have to do differently when children go back to school, when students go back to school. I mean, Denise touched on that. I think one of the things we're going to have to recognize is the stress levels have gone so high, not just for the students, but for the parents and for the teachers. And so there's going to have to be a lot of, I think, deep breaths and saying, how do we get through this together? Because the remote learning has been okay for some kids. It's been a disaster for other kids. And whether it was good or bad, all of a sudden they're going to go back into the classroom.
And we won't go back to the way it was.
Right.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
Yes.
And now they're going to go back and they're going to take all of the mental health challenges, all the family challenges that remote learning has, has put them through this past year. And everybody is bringing that back to the classroom. And so we have to rethink classrooms as safe spaces for people to learn to come to that place of trust again, to learn the issues with each other. And I think that that's going to be probably one of the biggest challenges that we have with schools is how do we take what's happened in this past year, and now we're going to go into like almost a year and a half, and hybrid learning has been great. It's also not been great. And we need to completely rethink the way people come back to that school environment, because it's not the same anymore. And if we don't go about with the new knowledge of all of the challenges that our students and our staff faced, we are just going to exacerbate what's happened over the last year and a half.
I totally agree. And also, young people, depending on what age they're at, I mean, they've had like visual, physical changes, right? So I might be beginning puberty, and maybe I didn't even have boobs or anything, but by the time I go back to school, when you see me for the first time, that's not going to be an initial like, oh, like you've changed. I didn't watch you gradually change. I mean, just something as simple as that, can have a big impact on how those responses end up happening with young people, with each other.
Well,
And
I think I think that that's also another point that, in all the work that we endeavor to do, that it should not just be on empowering Black girls and helping them build their leadership skills, which, we all are committed to doing, but we also need to educate male students on the issue of gender justice and gender and how to treat girls, because now they haven't been in the classroom with girls. They've been at home, and you're seeing somebody on a Zoom. And so we have to include them in that conversation as well.
Mm-hmm.
Good point.
It's a whole nother learning curve almost.
Yep.
Yeah, good point. I mean, the Columbus school that's in the documentary is an all-girls school. Mm-hmm. And I think that, Stephanie she said when she was offered the job, she has two boys. She said, well, I never wanted to work with girls. I mean, girls are so emotional. They have all this drama. And then she got to the school and made all those changes. And now, she loves working with girls, but it is just a girls' school. So what you're saying is really crucial about how kids are going to come back together after all this time.
Another question from the audience. How do educators and other mandated reporters navigate the potential risk of child protective services while also trying to genuinely seek help for their students? And we do know that this lockdown has seen an increase in abuse.
Not sure that's a question I can answer.
No, I know.
It's a tough one, but something very provocative, something for us to think about.
Well, and I think too that one of the big conversations too is also on, police in public schools. And
the special school resource officers,
exactly, or whatever fancy name, I definitely don't advocate for the presence of police in schools, but to the extent that they are already there, I think that we have to be very clear on what those policies are going to be, and that the agreements that counties or schools come up with, that they have to have language that authorizes law enforcement to only intervene when a student is participating in something that, say, is a violation of law. I mean, we've seen too many times where it's just completely blown up, and now we have young children in handcuffs and maced and thrown to the ground. And I think that we need to not only readdress how that is, but we need to engage the students in helping to develop that policy. Because again, these policies are made by people that are sitting in a back room, generally from a law enforcement perspective, and you may have an administrator, but again, and because of the work that I do in the space of criminal justice reform, one of the things that I always hold on to is the people that really are the experts are the ones that are living the experience. And so have their voices counted in developing policies for discipline, for dress codes, for this having police or school enforcement officers or whatever they're called, helping to develop those policies and having their voice matter, having that voice define and shape the policies that are going to directly impact them.
And letting them realize that they do matter, that we do care and love them.
And they are the experts.
Yes.
They know how a policy is going to impact them. They know how it's going to impact their peers. They know how they're going to ignore it. And truthfully, that's okay. Maybe I'm thinking about the criminal justice system there, but at the end of the day, they know, they have a good sense. And if we include them in these conversations, then really good, robust conversations can happen, but also strong policy can come out. And, people, that's how you get buy-in. People are included, they're at the table, they're wanted at the table, their expertise is sought, and out of that comes great product and trust.
And that's changed in Los Angeles now. I mean, they just voted to take police out of the classrooms across the city in all communities. And we adjust that money to be what is essentially going to be cultural counselors, people who can intervene, but not in a police way, intervene in a much more culturally appropriate way and emotionally appropriate. So that's the sea change that we'll see here played out in Los Angeles in the years to come. And they did that in Toronto. That was when we were talking about doing this documentary, we thought a lot about going to Toronto because they totally took police out of the schools and they've been thriving with it. So it can be done.
Another question from the audience. How do we deal with the issue of the perception by browner-skinned girls that lighter-skinned girls don't suffer? This is the colorism issue that keeps bubbling up.
Yeah, I mean, that's a complex issue. I mean, I think that, whether you're dark or light skinned, if you fit into the Black category, you're kind of all looped together. It's then within the category that you start to then see maybe a little bit of preferential difference, but you're still grouped into the category of being disadvantaged and being on the periphery and on the margins as well. So I think we've got to look at all the girls and not look at breaking this down between who's lighter and who's browner. I mean, I do know that there are, and that really comes into play depending on where you are. Like in the South, that tends to be more of an issue than I would say here on the West Coast. But I do recognize that there are some preferential differences that do happen, but it's minute. It's not enough that light-skinned girl is getting, some greater reward or some greater treatment.
She could even marry a prince and still get that.
There you go. There you answered it. Just in that, right?
And still be trashed. Yeah,
and still be trashed.
Yeah, as she has been in the UK, unbelievably. Yeah.
Another question from the audience. Let's see. How do you grapple with the overdiagnosis of children of color with OCD, excessive or ODD, which puts them at a much greater disadvantage? You can see the question there, particularly against their white counterparts, don't necessarily get diagnosed with or treated for.
Yeah, I mean, this is really such an important issue, and I think it goes back to what we've been talking about. How there's a certain amount of, I'm not sure this is the right word, but I'll use it, impatience when it comes to Black girls. That everything is elevated, everything is made more difficult when dealing with Black girls in certain situations. So I think they are, in fact, told more often than not that they're a problem, that they have some real problem. You saw that even with Samaya, who talked. Yes. She was 12 when she talked to us, but she was 7. And what she did with the quarter in the, I mean, there's any 7-year-old would have done that, but that teacher just went after her. And I think it's just really, again, that we're going to have to educate the educators and the people in charge to understand these girls in a better way and not overreact to everything that they do or do not do.
Well, I think it goes to training, much more in-depth kind of training, because I've seen it play out in some of the local schools that I've been, working with and volunteering at, that it's easier to label a Black girl as problem and trouble, and therefore she's got to have ODD, OCH, ABC, MOUSC, whatever the current initial thing is right now. But a white girl will be, referred to a doctor. A white girl will be referred, and the family will take her. Whereas there is much. There is less possibility of that happening, whether through a family finances or, the fear that we build into and the shame. And so I think that it really is this wholesale. We have to recognize that it's so much easier to slap a label on somebody than to just say, okay, let's figure out what's going on. Let's have a conversation and see what it is. Because when we put these labels on kids when they are this young, those labels follow them throughout their lives. And if they continue to exacerbate and they continue to get treated the way that Samaya, who, I mean, seriously, as a mom, I really just wanted to go hold this girl and say, you are loved, you are beautiful, oh my gosh. But I think that that plays out, and it just creates this perfect pathway to prisons. And then they get into the adult system where then, people like me have to advocate for them. And there were so many off-ramps before that weren't recognized. And it started with a label. It started with the unwillingness to have the deeper kind of conversation. And it was easier just to say, well, you have ADHD, or you have ODD, or you have something here. And even when they move through and they get through the juvenile system, I mean, the priority should be keeping people in school and not labeling them, not putting them as, on this path of delinquency, on this path of good girl, bad girl, and, ultimately ending up in the criminal legal system. And so I think that, again, it goes back to training, it goes back to compassion, and it goes back to, and really holding people accountable for, educating our children. We're trusting them. That Samaya's parents, I can't even imagine the things that couple went through. And, the father said it perfectly. We thought we were sending our daughter to be educated, and she was being bullied. And, how do we hold these teachers, these educators, these systems, the very systems that are designed and set up to help our students, to propel them on paths to success? How do we hold them accountable when they fail? How do we prevent them from failing? And so I think it's a much larger conversation than just, it's a simple thing of get involved with your children's classroom. I mean, it's going to take all of us. I hate to use that old cliche about the village, but truthfully, that's exactly what it boils down to, is we need to create villages around each of our students.
Yeah.
Kimberly, thank you for that. Here's another audience question. What happens to girls who aren't connected to programs and organizations that help guide them to their strengths and talents? What can we do about criminalizing young Black girls?
Oh, whoa, that is such an important thing that's being brought up because you see that all the time, that girls without that safety net, without the support system. You saw that with Tariana, who's now fine and is graduating from college and has a good job. But you just know that they're being left behind in a way that just leaves them vulnerable. I mean, Tariana was arrested. She's been in jail. She got the support system that she needed, but without that, you are just laying them open to being criminalized. One of the important things that's happening again in California, because it's where Denise and I live, so I know this, is that they've now stopped. They're trying to stop having juvenile detention. Yeah, I mean, putting kids in prison. We did a documentary called Education Under Arrest, which looked at the girls and boys who were in the system and were in jail learning. Although, as one of them said, that the school in the prison they were in was better than the school they had been in before, which was a really frightening thing to hear. But there were only 4 of them in the classroom and 2 teachers, and that made a huge difference. So this is a really important issue that we have to figure out how not to criminalize them in the first place. These are kids, these are teenagers, these are children, and you don't criminalize children.
Well, and I think when they don't have access to these support networks, these organizations, these programs, we know exactly what's going to happen to them. They're going to run away. They're going to end up on the street. They're going to be, too smart for their own, and they're going to find themselves in dangerous situations. We know the I-95 corridor, on the East Coast, where we have young Black girls disappearing all of the time. And they're ending up in horrific situations that we can't even comprehend. We need to engage prosecutors to not prosecute them. We need to engage progressive systems actors so that we don't criminalize them, so that we actually can put interventions in place, so that we can actually step in and make these referrals. There are amazing local community-based organizations and resources that are just chomping at the bit. And unless and until that collaborative network really gets built, then people don't know about each other. They're not talking to each other. And so how do we build that out so that people can get connected with those services and those programs, and they can have the safety nets?
Denise, what part does the adultification of these young girls play in the role of criminalizing them?
A huge part. I mean, we saw that again going back to the film with Samaya. She was 7 years old. And almost in the last part of her telling her story, where she went into a restaurant because she was thirsty. She had been roaming the streets for 2 hours. And she goes in simply to ask for a glass of water. They deny her that. They call the police. The police say, well, how old does she look? And they say 12. And she was clearly 7 years old, right? So a 5-year difference in her age to what they perceive. And that's what happens with Black girls a lot. So if I perceive you to be older, then I start putting all those perceptions of what I think your behavior should be. So if you're 7, but I think you're 12, right? I have I'm thinking differently. I'm thinking you should have some sense of, what you're doing and, why are you wandering the street and things of that nature. So this is really huge. There have been studies done on this showing that young girls as young as 5 are seen to be older, as old as 8 years old. And when you think about a 5-year-old who you could have with you falling out and having a tantrum, and if I thought that was an 8-year-old having a tantrum, I'm going to respond differently. And that's what happens to these girls. And also, if they are perceived to be older, so if they are a teenager and maybe they look like, maybe if they're 12 and they look like they're 17, I'm going to treat you differently. I might hypersexualize you.
Yes.
And then that leads into other challenges that these young girls have.
And I think it also goes back to something Kimberly was saying about the media and the way the images in the media portrays girls and sexualizes and adultifies girls at a much younger age. So the message they're getting also is quite mixed about how they should be and how they really perceive themselves. And the way they perceive themselves is probably 100% different than the way other people look at them and perceive them. And that disconnect is really something that is difficult and is damaging to the girls.
Let's see if we have another audience question. Here we go. How do we start a dialogue that puts Black girls first in policy, in communities, and with educators about the things in the film that are having a negative impact on them?
I think this film does it. I think what I talked about earlier, the $1 billion fund begins to do it. When you start putting attention onto this issue, whether you're aware or not aware of it, those become sort of the starting points. And then you get policymakers like Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, who got involved. She's been, she's for at least 15 years, this has been sort of her life work that she was doing before she became a congresswoman, working around these issues. So this wasn't new to her. Her doing this, putting forth, authoring that bill wasn't new for her in terms of understanding what the issues and the challenges are. And so it made it easier for her to rally around and to be able to draft something as quick as she did and get it into Congress. But I think the local politics have to. One of the things that when we did screenings, we did about 250 screenings. We would always try to insist on a local legislative person being there, no matter what, city council, we didn't care who it was, to come and listen to their constituents about the challenges that were being faced. And we always made sure that we had a young voice that was represented on the panel, so the girls can speak and tell their story the way that we told those girls' stories, through their own voices, because you have to hear what they're saying. And sometimes it's very heart-wrenching. It's really hard to imagine listening to a young girl talk about how she's being terrorized inside the classroom by a teacher, or what her home environment is like, and that her only outlet or her refuge is school, but the school doesn't support her. It's really, really hard to hear those stories, but this is the reality. These are the complexity of this issue that I started off saying early, right? And we talk a lot about intersectionality. And when we look at girls, we've got lots of intersectionality. We got race, we've got their gender, we got their sexual orientation, depending on who they are. We have their class, we have their economics, we have their family structure. So there's a lot wrapped around this one individual and helping her to be the best that we say as America, we promise this place to be.
And I just want to add one thing too, that with these screenings that we've done in communities, we've had a lot of educators be in the audience, and they want to know what the tools are. How can they do it differently? How can they get better at that? And one of the things that we're doing that's advancing this is we're doing short videos with experts weighing in with scenarios about how you do it now, how you might do it better, so that educators can actually start a dialogue with each other about what should we do when we're faced with this situation. How can we behave? How we as teachers, educators, behave better?
And I think that for me, the organizer on the ground and the organizer in my bones would say we do things like this. So having this screening tonight and having, both Kobe and Denise participate with this and tell us about the experience of making this film, that's a start, because now everybody who is on this call is going to go have a conversation with somebody. Conversation begets conversation. And so we, from Prison Cells to PhD, is actually going to be doing a book club on this book. We're going to be launching it in April. And so this will be another way, and thank goodness for Zoom. I'll be real honest. And so we can do virtual book clubs to engage people in this conversation so that we can have the policymakers who understand when they're pushing education bills at their state levels that there are voices that are missing from that conversation, and that these young girls that we're talking about, those voices have to be centered at that. And having opportunities, you can do any kind of Zoom event now. And so gather your private little book club, gather, all of your friends from church or whatever, and have this conversation. It is a difficult conversation to have, but it is an imperative conversation to have. And I think that this is a time for us to have this, to also be able to support legislation. From prison cells to PhD is going to be introducing legislation next session in 2022. And we can support Representative Presley's bill. And I know that they've been putting this information up in the chat while we've been talking, but there are ways of changing that dialogue and demanding better for our girls. And so, but it really starts with every single one of us that's on this call. Mm-hmm. Conversation begets conversation. Get involved with organizations like P2P. Get involved with, the organizations that I know some of them are in the chat that are working to address this issue. Support these organizations. Donate your time, donate your money, donate your voice, because that's how we can change the narrative. That's how we can shift the dialogue.
How do we start the conversation? How do we break the ice?
I know how I would, but I'm kind of the bull in the china shop on this one.
I mean, if you think there's not I would start with like the books and the materials. I would start with an article. I would start with them watching this film, whether it's the trailer or a longer clip of it. I would start with them seeing something. I would start with on our website, I know we have all these experts. We have video of them talking about various issues, from ACEs to intersectionality and understanding, what that really is to like dig in, right? I mean, when the George Floyd thing happened, a lot of people who were white were like, I don't really think I understand these issues. And a lot of people either called someone they knew if they were Black, or they went searching and tried to understand. That's where it begins. It's like really trying to understand what is actually going on. And once you understand, you figure out what's the lane you're in that you can help. What is it that you can do? Colby and I are filmmakers. So we brought this issue to light. We're not educators. We're not administrators. We're not policymakers. But we know how to use this film to get to educators, to get to administrators, and to get to policymakers.
And that's it. Use what's on the PUSHOUT website. There are so many great little clips. Those are the conversation starters. Share them through your social network. Share them with your friends, with your neighbors, and say, I want to talk about this. Join the book club that P2P is going to be doing. Start your own book club. I hate to plug Amazon because I spend way too much money there, but that's where you can buy the book. But again, take the information that's out there, and then as Denise was just saying, find your lane. Where are you comfortable working in, and use the tools that are there, because every conversation helps. Every conversation moves the needle.
And I'd just like to add one last thing, Karen, about this is also engage with your schools. Engage with the school, engage with the teachers, be present for them, talk to them, find out what is really going on, and have those conversations and help them change with the information that you have, and honor your kids. I mean, I think the thing with Samaya and her parents not believing her at first was a really important lesson. They said, well, the teacher, why would the teacher lie? Why would the teacher be a bully? So you really also need to listen with compassion to what your kids are saying, even if it takes them a long time to say it.
Let's try and get one more audience question in right now. Let's see. This documentary shows how without attention, there's a clear pathway to prison. How can we end that pathway?
By doing exactly what we've been talking about during this Q&A. Everything that we can do to dismantle that playground to prison pipeline is crucial, because we know that if we don't act on the front end, then that's how states are calculating how many prison beds that they're going to need. There was, I call it, criminal justice math, but that said that if a Black boy did not read at the 3rd grade level by the time he was like 8, then that's how the states knew how many prison beds. And it's true. I mean, I heard that and I shook me to my core. But they're already looking at, these are the people these are the kids that are going to go into our system. And so we need to put attention on this. We need to put a bright light, the biggest, brightest spotlight that we can on this issue, and also in offering alternatives, offering possibilities, offering challenges, offering hope, offering solutions, because at some point we're going to have the right message. It's going to resonate with the right person, and that starts the ball rolling. But again, it starts with every single person that's on this call tonight. I really don't want to advocate for them when they get to the adult system. I'll be real honest. I'm sorry, I really don't. And if there's a way that we can stop that, I'm all for it.
Yeah, one of the things, Susan Burton, who's in our film, and she's such an amazing person now and such an advocate for women coming out of prison. But she says that line that was so resonated so strongly, which is, if educators had been waiting for me, I wouldn't have gone to prison. And that's something, what Monique really said over and over again about the way she sees education and the way she sees our schools being a place of healing so that it can be a place of learning. And so going back to emphasize that we really do need to engage with our schools, because that's where our boys and girls are going to be for 6 hours a day, right? If not longer.
It is the key. Well, the last question, how do we change the narrative? And how do we empower girls?
I think, again, I want to keep coming back to the film, but that was our goal. The goal for the film was to change the narrative, right? The goal for the film was to put faces on this issue, and to see that this issue was across the country. So it's not just in urban cities. I mean, we went to a lot of places, some that weren't shown in the film. But definitely just to put the humanity into who these girls really are. And you can see them as girls and not see them as adult girls, but as girls. And there's only a short window, right, that we all had to be young. Short window. We got this much time to be an adult, but we have a short window to really be a girl or to really be a boy. And we should really allow that to happen for these young girls. And we rob them of this. We rob them. And for the rest of their life, we've got them scratching as an adult in a bad way, to the end of their life.
I would say we give them the space, the trust, and the love to write the narrative themselves. They're the experts.
And you see that with the girls. And just, I'll say that my last thing that I just want to let everyone know who saw the film, these girls are all doing fine now. So Maya's doing well in her new middle school. She's now in middle school. Ariana and Emma are in high school, and they're doing very well, and they stay in contact with the teachers from Columbus, because they don't let those girls go. And Tariana's doing really well at the foundation that she works in the Bay Area, and she's now, I guess, 22, and she has a baby girl, and she's thrilled to be a mom. So everyone's doing very well, and that's good to know.
That's amazing. That's the shift.
What a great way to end this discussion. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight, and to our incredible guests, Jacoba, Denise, Kimberly, and Tanaj. Thank you so much, not only for joining us tonight, but for creating this incredible documentary. And last but not least, thank you everyone that joined us. And if you want to get involved, we really encourage you. You can get involved at pushoutfilm.com, and from prison cell to phd.org. Both websites are linked on the chat, and you'll receive an email tomorrow with information about resources as well. And as always, you can reach us at MPT, email events@mpt.org. Thank you again, panelists. You were wonderful. Thank you, audience, for joining
Thank
us.
you.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing this conversation.
And have a good night.